Yeah, fair dinkum.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Interview with a Homebrewer. And this is, you could say, probably my peak because anyone who is a homebrewer and watches content knows about Brulosophy, but they may not know about the Homebrew Challenge, which we will get into later on in this interview. I'm joined by Martin, basically the face of Brulosophy. So, Martin, first of all, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much for your time. And it's currently Friday afternoon there. So, how was your week this week?
Oh, thanks, CJ, for having me on. And yeah, it's been good. It's been good. I brewed a new beer style this week that I'd never actually even tasted before, a
Okay.
hazy pale ale. So that was kind of
Ooh.
interesting learning what the
Okay.
difference between a hazy IPA and a hazy pale ale was.
Uh huh.
But I got to tell you, I just got to do the first taste of that this week. Highly
Okay.
recommend it.
Okay. Wonderful. Um. Yeah. Cool. So my first question, other than how your week has been or how your day has been, is for every homebrewer is always, what is your earliest memory of homebrewing?
Yeah, I started with Mr. Beer kits, which in the
Yep.
US is pretty common way to get started. I did also have one of these Cooper Pale Ale kits as well.
Yep.
Fun. That made ta fairly tasty beer. The the Mr. Beer kit was a disaster.
Okay.
So I
See, I
uh,
had
I
the other way
brewed that.
around.
Oh yeah? No,
Yeah, my
I could
first kit was the Coopers, and it was a disaster. I threw it out before even bottling it.
yeah. No, I mean I persisted and went through all the bottling stage and everything with the Mr. Beer kit, and it was not good. It turns out that I knew absolutely zero about homebrewing, zero. And I was just kind of
We
following
all
the
do at the
instructions.
start.
Right. And it's just like pour this goop in, add the yeast, close it up, done. I didn't know anything about sanitation and star san or anything like that. So I'm pretty sure it just got infected because what it did ferment, but it tasted very appley, which is a no-no
Okay.
flavor. So um, I did that. It was a disaster, and I just put homebrewing aside. Decided that was not for me for a good few years, and then I had a friend of mine. We were in a bar, and he was telling me that he could brew at home. So I said, "Oh my goodness, could you please come to my house and show me how to do it right?" And it's like, do not let anything touch the surface once the word is cold because infections and so I learned about star sand and all this sort of stuff and started making beer, actual drinkable beer at that point.
Yeah, nice. And so, therefore, after that, what was your first drinkable beer? You could say.
Well, the goal was to get a Belgian triple. That's one of my favorite beer styles. And
Yep.
I'm in North Carolina in the US. And when I
Mhm.
first moved here, they had a limit on the strength of beer that they could sell in the grocery store. So it's
Okay.
6% ABV was the maximum, which basically ruled out all Belgian styles of any
Yeah.
note. So then it became kind of a thing of like, well, I could still make that at home and that's legal. So
Yeah.
that
Yep.
kind of what got me into it is brewing a Belgian triple and I did it. Just a beer kit. It was an extract kit with some liquid malt extract and some maybe some steeping grains, but probably not. Just the liquid malt extract, which you boil, add in some hops, cool it, add some dry yeast, and leave it for I think that left it for like 2 or 3 months in bottle condition, and it was glorious. And at that point, then I was hooked.
Yeah, nice. That's wonderful. And I mean, my next question was going to be what got you into homebrewing, but you just sort of helped explain that as well, which is great. So thank you. So my next question for you would be kind of leaning into learning about star sand and whatnot. What are the three biggest learning curves, not mistakes, because we all learn from these things. What have been your three biggest learning curves you've made in your brewing journey?
Yeah, that's a really good question, CJ. And I was thinking about this. I would sort of put it into three different phases of
Yeah,
brewing that I've
go
been
for it.
through. Um, so the first was just to go from knowing nothing to being able to make a beer that was actually drinkable. That
Yep.
was, yeah, this stuff, you need to be clean, sanitary, you need to take care of that stuff on the cold side. So that was kind of learning phase one on the learning curve one is just being able to get work that would ferment into beer without any sort of obvious infections. Once you get to that, then it was moving from those packets of kits through to actually all grain, which is, just more or less the same thing, but just adding an extra step at the beginning, which is you're not starting with the malt extract. You actually have to start with the grains, which you crush, you add them to the water, and you basically make the same thing.
Yep.
You're making work, but you just have to go through a few extra stages. So that was the learning journey as well, because you got to learn now about temperature and grain size and all that sort of stuff. Uh, Once I figured that out, kind of the last thing is really just the how do I make like really good beer? And that's I
Like
wouldn't say I'm
sensational sort of beer.
yeah, and I I have some beers that I'm really happy with, some that still I'm not very happy with. So, this
Yep.
is not a I can
But
always make great beer
that's an
now.
ever evolving thing, yeah.
Yeah,
But you'll
exactly.
never have a bung batch these days.
Right, right. But because I there's some basic kind of things now that I taking care of now that I wasn't before. So for example, when I was brewing all grain, I would just fill up my brew kettle from the tap water, and maybe I put a Camden tablet in, maybe I
Now
wouldn't.
doing RO filtered water or something else.
Just straight up water, just straight tap
Okay.
water at first. And um, I always felt like my beers had a bit of a
Homebrew
house
twang.
kind of twang,
Yep.
house taste to
That's a
them.
thing. Yep.
And it was chloramine. So like
Yep.
the tap water here comes with chloramine. I realized why it was the case because in the spring every year they do a chlorine flush where
Okay.
the water comes out smelling like a swimming pool. And I realized then that every time I brewed a beer that time of year, it was really giving me that kind of taste. So I
Yep.
moved from that to using an RO filter. And
Yep.
so now I'm starting with clean water, and then I can add a few little water salts in to build it back up.
Yep.
Made such a difference. So that was kind of the
Honestly, yeah. I've
third
just
phase.
received an RO filter 2 or 3 weeks ago. Sponsored Century Water Filters in Australia. Go, everyone listening, click the link below. But sorry to cut you off. Absolute game changer. Honestly,
Yeah,
even with my fresh water kit, even my extract kit brews, it's such a game changer. Please continue.
yeah. I mean, the advantage it gives you is you know where you're starting. Like when you're starting with the city water, even if you can get the chlorine or the chloramine out, you still don't know what else is in there. Whereas if you're starting with RO water, it's basically nothing, and then you can add in the water salts that you want to
Yep.
to get the beer where you want it to be. With city water, with tap water, you're guessing. So
Yeah.
yeah, that has made the biggest difference. So it's just little things like that that you sort of pick up afterwards, which are absolutely not essential. If you want to brew beer and you don't have an RO filter, just use tap water or
Yep.
go to the store and buy some bottled water and use that.
Yep.
Um, but those are the sort of the little things that have been able to sort of build on top of what I was doing to be able to make beer, which I think most of the time is like on par with the stuff I could buy commercially.
Yes, no, absolutely. And speaking of commercially, what that kind of tangents into a question a bit further down, but I'll bring it up. What is your go-to commercial beer at? I mean, apparently pubs aren't really a thing in the US. So what I'll say is, what is your go-to commercial beer when you're out and about with friends?
Uh, I guess it's fair to say pubs are not a thing. I mean, there's tap rooms everywhere. There's like four or five just within a couple of miles of my house.
Oh wow,
So plenty of breweries with tap rooms, and almost all of the bars here now have got a
have
ton of
craft.
craft beer options,
Okay then.
which is
Yep.
is so different to when I first moved here. I'm from England, and when I
Yep.
first moved here 20 years ago, American beer was a joke. I mean, it was Bud Light and Coors Light, and if you were lucky, you would get an import beer like a Corona or something, and that was
Yep.
considered good. And then the only kind of craft option were Sam Adams, Sierra Nevada, eventually that sort of thing.
Yep.
American beer, we used to make fun of it in England all the time.
We do
Now,
here, not the
yeah,
craft scene, but the commercial scene. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But now the just you go to any small little restaurant or anything, and there are probably going to be like 10 beers on tap and a really good choice of craft beers. It has changed so much in the time that I've been here. So, as for favorite drinks, I mean, my favorite overall commercial beer is Guinness, which is a very boring answer.
No, not a
But
boring answer at all. I love Guinness myself.
yeah, you just can't beat that. I also really love some of the English styles, which ironically I didn't really love when I lived in England. But now, when it's difficult to get a cask ale, I absolutely crave a cask ale.
Yeah.
So yeah,
No, that's fair enough. Also, to anyone watching the video, I am not drinking a beer. It's just an energy drink, just in case people think, because I may not recognize the logo, just because it's 6:30 a.m. here. Um, it'd be very irresponsible if I was to be drinking at this time of morning, even though it's a Saturday. So I just thought I'd clarify that for anyone watching and they see me swigging from a can. Um, yeah, no, that's really interesting to hear that, you know, you weren't too phased on the English styles when you were over there, and then now you'd give anything for it. But now you know what's great, you can brew your own sort of thing if you really
Actually.
really um comes down to it. Now, my next question for you is: a lot of homebrewers know you from Brulosophy. Obviously, you are definitely the face of Brulosophy at the moment. But you actually started, if I'm not mistaken, on your original channel called the Homebrew Challenge. First of all, when did you start that up? And what drove you to continue on? And obviously, we will get into the Brulosophy stuff after this.
Yeah. So I did have a channel even before that, very
Oh, wow.
briefly, called Homebrew How To, which was just me and a buddy when we were learning still. We just moved from extract to all grain. And we're like, you know what? Let's put up some videos. And I thought Homebrew How To, it kind of got a ring to it, sort of
Was.
rhymes. That sounds cool. That was a terrible, terrible choice for a name. Terrible, because we did not know how to at all. So we
Gotcha.
were putting out these brew day videos, just like 3 or 4 minutes of, hey, here we're trying to brew a 10-gallon batch of something, and making all sorts of mistakes along the way. And the YouTube comment section was not kind to a
Oh,
channel called
okay.
Homebrew How To when
Yep.
we were clearly making these very fundamental mistakes. But it was actually one of the best things ever because I was basically getting free help from homebrewers who would watch what I'm doing, like experienced
Yeah.
homebrewers who knew their stuff. They'd watch what I'm doing, and as long as you don't mind being called an idiot, then you'd learn so much
Yeah.
from that.
Constructive feedback. You got to pick it and figure out how to work it into a positive. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So I was doing that, but what I found, I was kind of getting in a bit of a rut with brewing, that I would brew the same sort of styles over and over again. So I like Belgian triple, I'd brew a Belgian triple. I like British bitter, so I brew a British bitter. Then I do a Guinness. Then I do
You were
a
brewing what
pale
you
ale.
liked,
Yeah, and I would just go through doing the
which
same
there's nothing
styles
wrong with that.
over.
But yeah.
Well, there isn't nothing. There's nothing wrong with that at all, except I I ended up not brewing very much because I was kind of bored of it. It's like, I'm just doing the same old stuff. So at that point, I was like, I need to find a new direction if I want to stay in this hobby. And that's where the idea for the Homebrew Challenge came about. So what the Homebrew Challenge was to brew every beer style in the BJCP guidelines. So these are the guidelines that kind of define what the styles are in beer judging competitions. And there are 99 main styles. So I was like, right, I'm going to do them all. And then I thought, let's do one a month. That seems reasonable. And then I started to kind of calculate what that would mean. I'd be doing this for years and years and years.
Yep.
So okay, let's do this one a week. Let's do it. So the homebrew challenge was to brew 99 beers in 99 weeks. That was the stick. And I would brew the beer, I would film my brew day, make a video about it, taste the beer, and so forth. And for
Did you get all
basically for the
99
next
done?
yeah, for the next 2 years, I went through. After about 4 or 5 episodes, I knew I was completely out of my depth, that this was a ridiculous challenge because what I hadn't really thought about, I thought about the brewing once a week. I'm like,
Yep.
that's gonna be hard, but I'll get up early on a Sunday, I'll do it, it'll be fine. But when you have a beer brewed, you also have another beer that's probably in the fermenters, and then you have
Yep.
another beer that needs to get into a keg, and then you need to do a tasting for another beer, and
Yep.
then you need to be prepping for the next beer for the next week, so get the
Yep.
ingredients and make the recipe for that. So I'd be working on 5 different beers every week
Yep.
for 2 years. And not to mention that, as you know, CJ, editing video is not exactly the fastest thing to do in the world either. So I would have to deal with that. It was like, it felt like a full-time job. I had a full-time job, but it felt like a second one. But once I'd sort of got going and I got a few sponsors to help me like supply ingredients and stuff like that, I was kind of committed and I had to keep going.
Yep.
Um, and I was stuck with it for 2 years, and it was tremendously fun, but also an incredible amount of work. And I will never ever brew that many beers in that short a period of time again.
That's fair enough, but that's really awesome to hear because that was going to be my next question: the 99 beers in 99 weeks. But now obviously you are the figurehead or face of Brulosophy, and I just recently watched your video over on the Homebrew Challenge, saying goodbye and Marshall approaching you, etc., to get a bit of a backstory. So my next question for you is: Marshall did approach you from Brulosophy to ask you about running a weekly show, for lack of a better term. But how did that all come about? And how is it going for you? A year and a bit, maybe. I think it's maybe even 2 years now, if I'm not mistaken. How that's going for you?
Yeah. So I originally reached out to Marshall years ago when I just started the Homebrew Challenge, and
Yep.
look at Brulosophy and everything they were doing, and I'd be listening to the podcast and all that. And he'd built a business around this whole thing. He had sponsors on his podcast, the website's got brewing sponsors and stuff like that. And here I was starting the Homebrew Challenge, and I'm thinking, I've got to buy thousands of dollars of ingredients here. What on earth should I do? So I just randomly sent him a note. I didn't expect a response and just said, look, I'd like to chat with you a little bit about the business side of Brulosophy. How are you able to actually run this as a business, all these experiments you do and stuff like that? And he was so kind to come back and send me this huge long note with different sort of guidance on what to do. And ultimately, because of that, I ended up partnering with a local homebrew store. They supplied the ingredients for the
Yep.
homebrew challenge, and in exchange, they would take my recipes and sell them in the store. So that was great, and that was that. I didn't speak with Marshall again for years until he messaged me and said, could I come on his Patreon podcast?" So
Yep.
they have a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world, and there'd been a request from some of the Patreon members to get some YouTubers on. So
Okay.
because of the Homebrew Challenge, I was one of the guests who was invited on. So I came on that, um, and just presented for an hour about some of the stuff I was doing. And then we started talking about, why does Brulosophy not have a YouTube channel? Because you have the website, you have two podcasts. It seems the obvious thing to do YouTube. And we must have been talking for at least 6 months until we figured out what a YouTube show for Brulosophy would be.
Yep.
Um, and it wouldn't just be me brewing a different beer every week, because Brulosophy is much more about the science side of things. So what could we do that was achievable uh, in a weekly kind of series through Brulosophy? And yeah, it took us a long time to figure that out. And then yeah, so that started about 18 months ago or something like that. We
Yep.
released the first episode February of last year, and have been doing pretty much weekly episodes ever since then.
And they more or less, I'm guessing, was experiments, which is beer experiments, obviously, for lack of a better term. And so my question for you is, who came up with that, or was it a joint idea? And what has been your favorite experiment so far?
Oh, cool, that's a good question. So yeah, so to explain they're experiments. We call them experiments,
Yep.
BEER. Everything in Brulosophy is a pun. So
Absolutely.
Marshall came up with these. This was what started Brulosophy. The story he tells is that he was just trying stuff at home, and he would post his findings on Reddit as I think just his handle was Brulosopher on Reddit, and he would just like try stuff at home of brewing two batches of beer and just changing one thing between the two batches, so isolating stuff to a single variable and seeing what the outcome was. And what he was intending to do was to kind of validate brewing recommendations. So, there's certain things that we're told we should do as brewers. We should ferment lagers at temperatures lower than we ferment ales, for example. And if you ferment your lager too high, you're going to end up with something that doesn't taste very clean. You're not going to be happy with it. Stuff like that. Or that you should pitch a certain amount of yeast into your batch. Well, Marshall went in wanting to prove these things out. And what he found was that oftentimes brewing convention would result in two beers that he couldn't tell apart. Like they kind
Wow.
of tasted the same. Um, and then it got expanded to include the triangle test. Now, this is one of the funnest things I get to do. So every time we do an experiment now, we'll brew two beers. We will isolate the whole process down to one variable. So everything is exactly the same except for one thing. And then we will present those beers to tasters to see if they can tell the beers apart. And the idea being, if they can't tell the beers apart, then whatever that variable you did was didn't matter.
Yep.
So maybe you only boiled for 30 minutes instead of an hour, or you fermented warmer than you were supposed to, or something like that. If the resulting beers to people who were blinded to the variable couldn't tell a difference, well, then did it matter? The variable doesn't make a difference. And the way that they do that is through a triangle test. So you get these three colored cups,
Yep.
and I have a closet full of red, green, and blue cups. And we put two of the same beer into two of the cups, and one of the different beers into the third cup, present them to the taster. They'll try all three beers, and their task is to say which is the odd beer out. Two of these are
Yep.
the same, one is different. Tell me which one's different.
Yep.
And if enough people can tell which is the odd one out, then we say the experiment was significant, which means statistically speaking, these beers are different. In many cases, people could not reliably tell the odd one out, and these were marked as non-significant results and have been really, really interesting. So the fact that these experiments have been written primarily as articles on the website where there's just a few pictures, or they've been discussed as podcasts, we really felt that this was a perfect medium for video because
Absolutely.
now we could actually show the whole brew day. We could talk visually about the variable that we're making, and really show it off that way. And you asked what was one of my favorite experiments.
Yep.
Um, I would say it was cold crash speed was probably one of my
Yeah.
favorites so
I
far.
actually
So,
I actually just watched that one yesterday, believe it or not.
oh,
Um,
cool.
yeah, and wow, it is very interesting.
Yeah, so that's a good visual one because the thing that we were testing is does cold crash speed affect head retention on a beer? So something very visual. And this came to us from John Palmer, who's the author of the How to Brew book. And he told me, you should drop your cold crash speed by 3 degrees Celsius every 12 hours. Because if you go too fast, you're actually creating stress on the yeast. The yeast will excrete lipids, and that will destroy the head retention on your beer. And I'm like, I don't think that sounds right. I mean, cold crashing speed, really? But we tried it and it absolutely
Lower
panned
gave
out.
you an hour longer head retention while you were recording with John, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly. Yeah, we were on
Yep.
this call, and at the end of the call, this thing still had a nice cap of foam. And I tried it again on another brew a couple of weeks later, and the difference there was actually even more
Wow.
remarkable. That one had the head retention pretty poor, and the other one was just like half the glass was beer head for like half an hour or so. So
Oh wow.
it was, yeah, it was really interesting. So just stuff like that, that things that I wouldn't expect to make a difference,
One of
actually
my
making a
favorite
difference.
ones that's very visual, if you don't mind me chirping up you
Yeah.
guys, is the biofine versus gelatin versus the clear firm or firm clear. Because that is again another very visual, because obviously people who don't want a hazy regular pale ale or a lager or whatever, they can use these, adjuncts sort of thing. And yeah, watching that one because you can say I'm a big fanboy of biofine. I actually run it in post um, post brewing in the keg, but I actually don't use it. I don't actually open the keg. I run it through a syringe through
Oh,
a
nice.
gas disconnect. That way, there's
Yes.
almost no oxygen that goes through. But that's not to say that people can think of that or do that. But by the way, guys, head over to Homebrew Network. He has a video on how to do that, and it's very cheap for what you do. But gelatin really, obviously, is the winner, and it's I don't use biofine because of the vegan, for lack of a term, because obviously that is technically if you're using gelatin, cutting out a majority of your friends if you have vegan friends or what have you. I just definitely prefer biofine. Not a sponsored ad by Kerry or anything like that, Kerry Biofine. Um, but it was very interesting to see the differences and how long it actually took, biofine versus gelatin in particular. Gelatin was so much faster, for lack of a term, clearing the beer.
Yeah, that's right. So basically we've sort of found Clarity Firm doesn't do a whole lot at all.
Yeah.
Although that's not its intended purpose. I think it's to reduce the gluten in the beer
Yep.
anyway. But yeah, I found that Biofine is pretty good. Not
Oh,
as
it's
not
it's not as good.
quick, but not
Yeah,
as quick as
sorry,
gelatin.
not as quick. Not that it's not as good. It's not as quick.
Take a bit longer to get there, yeah. But I mean, the other side of that is a lot of people have said that if you add any kind of clarifying agent like that, you're stripping flavor from the beer
Yeah, I've
by
heard that.
making it that clear. And we've done a
Have you
lot of
run an
experiments.
experiment? Yeah, have you done an experiment for that?
Yeah, a bunch, and we have never had a significant result there. People cannot tell when you take away the visual aspect and you put them in these opaque
Mm,
glasses so people can't see the color of the beer. People cannot tell these beers apart, no matter biofine, gelatin, whatever. So
okay.
you do not have to worry about that. Um, and honestly, I think it is worth doing because just when you see a really bright beer in a glass, a homebrewed beer like that, it just looks so professional that I
Yes.
feel like you're going to perceive the beer in a better light anyway.
So anyone that's listening to this or watching this and they're thinking, "Oh, do I need to use biofine or gelatin, just let it condition in the keg or whatever vessel you're using, even if it's a PET bottle, for a few weeks. Because I find that leaving it to condition for 2 to 3 weeks, four depending, I pour a glass one per week just to see how the clarity goes. And 95% of the time for myself and my brews, it's pretty sensationally clear after the third ish week. So keep that in mind, everyone, because yeah, I find that that helps miraculously. And then only then, if it's still not as clear as I personally would like, I will then whack in some biofine or some gelatin, etc. But what do you think, Martin?
Yeah, exactly the same. I just had a an English pale ale on tap for it's probably in the keg for a month or two,
Yep.
and it was not fined at all. I didn't really care about it being fined, especially because it's an English kind of bitter. But by the time I got to the bottom of the keg, that thing was pouring absolutely crystal clear. I would say the biggest thing you can do if you're not going to find it and you want the clear beer is yeah, is absolutely time, but also to make sure you don't move the keg because
Yeah.
if you start pick the keg up and move it around and stuff like that, anything that's settled on the bottom gets shaken up and put back into solution again.
Yes,
Or you
exactly.
could use you could use a floating dip tube as well because that will pull the beer from the top instead of the bottom.
Yeah, that's true.
A good way of doing it. But generally, if you just keep your keg in cold conditions for a few weeks and it doesn't move, it's gonna clear up on its own.
No, absolutely. Um, that's actually a really good statement as well with the don't move your kegs, because I have my kegs set up specifically in my kegerator. They do not move except for when they're empty and I need to obviously wash them out and clean them.
Yep.
Um, but other than that, they literally stay exactly where they are. I CO2 pressure transfer directly as they are in the fridge as well. Because again, why would you move them if you don't have to? Especially if you're filling it up or adding CO2 or what have you. My next question for you is: you have over 400 issued patents to your name in the tech industry, if I'm not mistaken. How have you used AI to brew beer?
Yes. Um, I've I've done a few, I guess you call them experiments with AI and beer. I think when ChatGPT got popular, everyone was like, "Hey, ask ChatGPT for a beer recipe, see what it gives me."
Yep,
Um, and I did the same thing. I actually used a model prior to ChatGPT. So I mean, yeah, I work with AI in my job, so I was
yep,
familiar with this a little bit earlier than ChatGPT. And I trained an AI model on some award-winning blonde ale recipes. I figured that was a nice, easy style that the AI should know plenty about. And
yep,
I gave it like, here's 20 award-winning recipes. I now want you to come up with your own recipe. And it did. It came up with a recipe. And it was unique. It wasn't in the training data set I gave it. I looked up online. I couldn't find anything that matched it. So I was like, okay, it's actually built me this is an AI generated blonde ale recipe. I got to brew it. So I brewed
yeah.
it. Um, it was it's all right, I guess. Nothing
Wasn't
special,
great.
very middle of the road.
Yep,
Which I shouldn't be surprised about because it doesn't know anything about beer. It was just kind of aggregating responses and like, here's another one that's like an average of all these other ones, and that's exactly what it tastes like, an average beer. But with some of the newer models, so GPT-4, which came out 18 months ago or so, when that came out, I said, I really want to do this properly. So I ended up doing an actual experiment with it where I wanted to pick a much harder style. So I picked dark Weizenbock, which is
ooh,
not a style your average person is going to be, creating
brewing.
recipes for.
Yeah,
And this time, instead of just like give me a recipe, I was like, give me step-by-step guidance on everything that I need to do to brew this beer. So the brew day, exactly what I should do, what mash temperature should I use, how long should I do stuff for, what fermentation temperature should I use and for how long, and all this sort of stuff. So it wasn't just kicking out a recipe, and I just followed it step by step to to brew this dark Weizenbock, and it was really, really detailed. And I was telling a friend of mine this, he's a grandmaster brewer,
yep,
and I showed him the recipe and said, "What do you think?" And he's like, "Wow, this is actually really impressive." He said, "But I could do a better dark Weizenbock recipe than that." So, so he sent me his
yeah,
own dark Weizenbock recipe, and that this recipe was like this long with all the process steps that I needed to do to brew it. I was like,
yep,
right, I'm going to be the common factor here. I'm going to brew this exact beer on this same system I brewed the AI beer.
yep,
So I followed his steps. brewed that, and now I have two beers: the AI generated recipe beer, and
Yep.
then the
It's a great
Grandmaster beer.
experiment to do this. Yeah.
Yeah. So then I took the beers to a brewery, to like a panel of professional beer judges,
Yep.
and didn't tell them anything other than to say, here are two Dark Weizenbocks. I want you to evaluate them both and tell me which one you like the best. Is one a better example of a Dark Weizenbock than the other?
Yeah.
What we were looking for. So nothing about AI. And they go through this whole process. And if you've not been involved with beer judging, it is a process, right? Uh, it's it took them about 20 minutes to evaluate the beers because they're going through everything from appearance to mouthfeel to flavor, aroma, the aftertaste on it, everything. They're going through it and they're scoring it all like this, and they're very thorough. And they get to the end, and they had reached a unanimous opinion that one of these beers was clearly a better example of a dark Weizenbock than the other. And I was like, oh, I would love it if it was the AI one because,
Yeah.
this would be so funny. So they talk me through it and they say, the one that we like best is beer B, and beer B was the AI beer. So they did
Oh,
like the AI beer best. And the funniest thing is that the human generated recipe has actually been entered into a number of competitions since then, and it has won medal after medal. It is a
wow.
really good example of a Dark
Yeah.
Weizenbock. But apparently, at least to these judges, the AI generated one was even better. So at that point, I was like,
Wow.
this is very impressive.
That is, yeah, wow. Like I'm genuinely speechless, which is very hard to do for me. Which, wow, that's incredible. Oh,
Yeah, so it just
honestly,
goes to show that it was able to not just average out what the recipes were before.
yeah,
That was what it was doing before, but now it was really telling me detailed process steps, and not just do this and this. Here's why you want to do this as well. So
yes.
we really want to bring out more banana and less clove. Therefore, you should ferment at this temperature, not this temperature, that sort of thing. So even down to how many billion yeast cells it thought I should add in. So very, very thorough.
It's incredible, honestly. And um, my next question kind of tails off the you went to your local like your Grandmaster Brewery friend, and they were like, you know what, here's a recipe for it. So my next question is, what is the best piece of advice you've ever been given about homebrewing?
Oh, the best advice. I mean, I think the thing that I've learned from Brulosophy, I don't know if anyone's actually sat down and told me this, but this would be the advice I would give now, is just conventional wisdom for how to brew at the commercial level absolutely does not have to apply to the homebrew level. Stuff that big commercial brewers do, I think a lot of the time people think, well, if the pros are
Sometimes
doing
isn't
that,
even transferable.
yeah, well, of course, sometimes there's just the scale is so different, right?
Yep.
Um, but oftentimes it's not just the scale or that you couldn't do this at home. It's just that you don't need to do this at home because the
Yeah.
reason that brewers do things sometimes is to, for example, maximize yield from their ingredients to get the most beer out of it as possible.
Yep.
So one thing that I adopted very quickly through the homebrew challenge was time for me was a big issue because I'm brewing every week. So I want the shortest brew day possible. So I switched to 30-minute mashes and 30-minute boils. Now to do that, you need to add a few more grains into the mash because you're getting less efficiency. And the boil is going to mean you're going to need to add a few more hops in order to get enough isomerization to create the bitterness that you're looking for. At a homebrew level, we are talking about pennies of additional ingredients in order to do that. At the commercial level, nobody's brewing mashing for 30 minutes and boiling for 30 minutes. That would be madness because the additional grain and hops that you would need would just be so prohibitively expensive, it would make no sense. But that's an example where they're not doing that because a 60-minute mash makes a better beer necessarily. They're doing it because it makes more sense for their business. And once you start to understand the reason isn't always just because it's better and it makes better beer. That's the thing that made me understand there's a lot of things we can do as homebrewers to experiment with stuff that will result in beer that is just as good, even though we've taken what might be considered shortcuts.
Yeah, no, I absolutely get what you mean there. And tangenting, or you could say not tangenting, tailing off the back of that. What are the three? What are three bits of advice you would give to a new or fresh home brewer?
Three bits of advice. I mean, the first thing I would say is that, this is supposed to be fun. And sometimes, wait, especially when you go to some of the online forums,
Oh, yeah,
it can be a little toxic of you should do this and you absolutely are brewing crap if you do that sort of thing.
I
So,
literally went through all of the forums. So, well, not all of, but as many as I could find
yeah,
on Facebook groups and whatnot. And I sifted out, who I believe, at least that I've had good engagements with, whether it was comments or inboxing them directly. And I've created a Facebook group chat and I've called it the Homebrew Brains Trust because there's some people who own a brewery. There's one that owns a homebrew shop. There's a few that do all grain that have won medals. Then there's me. And then there's a bloke who only started brewing about 2, 3 weeks ago, you know? That's because they're not people that are saying, "Oh yeah, can I use this extract tin that's 2 years out of date?" And they're not commenting, "Yeah, send it, go for it." You know, they're not those types of people because as I'm sure you're about to say, you'll get a lot of those sort of weeds, you could say. And yeah, so I created the Homebrew Brain Trust as a place where rather than an actual group or a forum, if someone has a question, whether it's a newbie, because I'll add a newbie into the group chat if they're getting fed to the lions by comments and people giving absolutely. Now, there is obviously good advice, but there is also definitely bad advice as well. And to a newbie, you don't know what to believe. Whereas I've figured out as many as I could find, I've put them in together in a group chat so that way they don't have to worry about going onto a group post or in a forum and getting 9 or 20 or 30 comments giving the absolutely definition of wrong advice sort of thing. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Please continue.
No, if you, I think that's wonderful. I think it's one. And I was listening to your episode with Gavin from Homebrew Network, and Gavin was saying that he had a Facebook group that he was
Yep.
managing ahead of doing all this YouTube stuff, and it was just too much the kind of things that people would
Oh
be
yeah.
saying for that. Yeah.
Yeah, daily I see in Facebook or on Facebook groups, at least Australian based Facebook groups, where, for example, this tin, this one goes out of best before 14th of November next year. So well in date. But say I was to post this in, you know, December 2026 and say, do you got take a photo of this, post it saying, guys, do you think it's safe for me to brew this? Because technically it's the expiration date of the yeast that it came with, but that's not the point. Um, because this also does have a shelf life. And you'll see comment after comment of people saying, send it, or yeah, should be fine. Yeah, it'll be good. Just use a different yeast with it. This, that, that. No, do not bloody do that. Please, for the love of all things holy and brewing, don't do that. Sorry, please continue.
Yeah, no. I mean, look, we have a little group chat going from the Brulosophy Brew crew, all of the
Yep.
people behind Brulosophy, and we have comment sections, and we get a lot of interesting comments you can say from people just telling us we don't know what we're doing and stuff. So yeah, first bit of advice: we're doing this for fun,
Yep.
and for anyone to get upset about the the way you're adding hops into your word or something is just absolutely ridiculous. The second thing I would say, something that the Homebrew Challenge taught me was to actually go out and try brewing some unusual beer styles. Like
Yep.
I had never had an alt beer, and I'm not sure I'd even ever heard of it before.
Yep.
And that was on the list of things to brew, and it turned out to be one of my favorite styles. I love an alt beer now, so
Okay.
being able to experiment with styles that you can't just like go out and buy them
Yeah.
is a really fun part of home brewing. I think it's what attracted people to home brewing originally is that the availability of craft beer was not that great initially, and you would need to go out and make it yourself if you wanted it. Now you go to the grocery store or wherever, and there's a ton of different craft beer options, but there's still mainly, IPAs, hazies,
Yeah.
sour,
You won't get a
Berliner.
dark Weissenbach sort of thing.
You're right, exactly. You want a dark Weizenbock? Good luck. Good luck finding
Yeah.
one of those. So, being able to just branch out and try styles that maybe you wouldn't necessarily have otherwise tried, absolutely worth doing. Um, so yeah, that'd be advice number two. And then advice number three, I mean, I say this because of a year and a half at Brulosophy, is just the power of experimentation. It is so fun to try something different.
Yep.
brewing in a different way or using a little bit of different gear, or like the hack you mentioned with, being able to add finings into your keg without exposing it to oxygen, stuff like
Yep,
that.
this
Right.
and literally with a syringe in there. Yeah, a 10 mil
Yeah.
syringe.
Yeah. I love stuff like that. I absolutely love figuring out stuff like that. Um I was using a soda bottle as a
Yeah,
CO2
I
tank.
saw that. Yep, and you've
That's
you found that the 2 liter soda bottle rather than the 600 ml soda bottle obviously goes without saying held more bar or more psi and therefore was able to push more of the liquid out into. You were using a beaker for the example, but so for the experiment, but it was able to push out more liquid because it was able to hold more psi of CO2.
it was
But
honestly terrifying,
yeah,
because you
you were
can
going to
add
explode the bottle.
yeah, you can add a huge amount of pressure to these soda bottles, and they're designed for it. I mean,
Yeah,
apparently
but
they
it
keep
still
on
doesn't
pushing
make it
out.
like
No,
ah.
I mean, I put on like safety goggles, and I was like, oh, putting this here because if this thing explodes, this could be bad. But there's a whole key from Kegline taught me through what to do,
Yep.
and you pressure test it with water first, so as not to put too much strain on it. And it worked fine. Stuff like that. I mean, there's just so many things of just tweaking and playing around, and maybe it's something you found online. Maybe it's like you just got some pieces of equipment and you want to try something doing it yourself. That's honestly the most fun part of homebrewing for me, is just the sort of the invention side of coming up with and playing around with stuff.
Yeah, one of the things that I found for myself when I was still using HDPE fermenters, but I wanted to do a closed transfer, well, as in to the point where not actually even opening my keg, my lid, of my corny, was actually stepping down in the sense of using from the spigot or spout of the part of my brain fart because I'm a bit sick. The spout of the HDPE, attaching a 12 millimeter hose, and then stepping that down to a 10 mil, then stepping that down to a 8 mil, then down to a 6 mil, and then adding a liquid ball lock disconnect right onto. And that way, the stepping down, because obviously they seal around each other, so then I can do an actual closed transfer, even though it was gravity, but it was still a closed, no oxygen
Right.
transfer into the keg. It's those sort of things because I've seen people who have won awards at homebrew comps. They're just, which is fine, and I'm not putting any part of my language shit on them at all when I say this, but I've seen them, do the gravity transfer, but they've got it pouring straight into an open lid of a keg, which again is fine, but obviously they're going to purge that of oxygen, but it just saves you having to do that. But if you just simply do the stepping down, if you've got the hose and the equipment to do it, I was like, I'm going to give this a run, and it worked. And until I got my pressure fermenters, that's what I was doing.
Yeah, and we get a lot of comments on Brulosophy that a lot of these experiments they come back as non-significant, like, oh, nothing matters. Why is nothing coming back is coming back as non-significant? One of the things that almost always comes back significant is cold side oxidation.
Yep.
That makes a very big difference to beer. So doing things like you're describing there of performing a closed transfer can make a tremendous difference, especially to the shelf life of the beer. And
Okay.
it
Yep.
does depend on the style a bit, but the hoppier,
Of
generally
course.
the hoppier the style, or the more protein in the style, like a hazy beer, you want to really reduce oxygen as much as you can. So stuff like that. I did a hazy IPA in a Kegland All Rounder, which is just like a
Yep.
circular PET
Yep.
keg,
Pressure fermenter. Yep.
and I wanted to add dry hops in after 3 days and after 5 days, but I didn't want to open up the top.
Yep.
So I added in little hop bags with the hops in, and then
Yep.
I uh, put them on the side of the keg using magnets. And
Yep.
then when it was time to add the next hop addition, I would just pull it away, and the dry hops would pop
That's a
in.
great idea.
But yeah, just stuff like that. It was tremendously fun. Or my the other favorite one for purging kegs, like
Yep.
when you close transfer into a keg, the keg itself is full of air. So
Yes.
the best way to get rid of that is if you fill the keg up with, let's say, water with a mixture of star san. You've displaced all the air and put it with water. Now you need to get rid of the water, so you can just kind of use CO2 to pump that out, and what's left is just CO2, and it's ready to receive your beer. But then you have to use a whole amount of CO2 to empty that water out. A trick that somebody at Brulosophy showed me was to kind of daisy chain kegs.
Yep.
So you use the CO2 from fermentation. So instead of that just coming out of a bubbler or something, you actually transfer it into your keg that's full of water. And that keg is then connected to an empty keg. And what
Yep.
happens during fermentation is the water gets pushed out by the CO2 generated by fermentation into the second keg, leaving you with a keg just full of CO2 that's ready to receive the transfer. You didn't have to do anything. You didn't use up
Yep.
any of your own CO2, and it just did it by itself. So yeah, just stuff like that.
Oh, it's honestly it's mind blowing, and it's always fun because at the as you said at the start um of the advice is homebrewing is meant to be fun. And what's more fun than experimenting with brews?
Exactly.
Trying a brew you haven't done, or figuring out a way to do a close transfer, or a daisy chain, or a what have you. And so, my final question for you, Martin, is what's next for yourself and also for Brulosophy?
Yeah, I mean, we are starting to plan the episodes now for 2025
Yep,
Brulosophy show. We went when I got started, I was doing weekly episodes, and then we
yep.
moved to every 2 weeks because, like, oh my goodness, this is a lot of work. It's
It's
becoming like the
a
Homebrew
lot more
Challenge
of a
again.
production than it was before. Yep,
Yes, right. It's because now, like, if you do an experiment brew, I got to brew 2 beers instead of one,
yep,
and then I've got to present it to at least 20 tasters and collect their data and all this stuff. It's like it's a lot of work.
yep,
So what I realized pretty quickly was that I am one person of many who are at Brulosophy, and they have over 500 experiments they've already done. So I cottoned on pretty quickly that actually I could just talk sometimes about previous experiments in the video rather than having to brew my own
yep,
and kind of bundle them together. So I talk about, for example, beer clarity. Here's 3 different experiments we've done on beer clarity. Here are our findings, that kind of thing. Um, what we're trying to move to next year is to really do a lot more with the brewing community. So the Brulosophy itself has a Patreon members that
I'm a
help us
Patreon
out.
member of Brulosophy. Yep,
Thank you very much.
no
So,
problem.
so one of the things we want to do is to get the Patreon members a bit more involved in some of the episodes. So we actually have put out like here's a question we want you to answer, and we're going to put together a video of what the patrons told us.
Yep.
We're doing stuff with the Brew Club as well, which is kind of an online brewing community affiliated with Brulosophy.
Uh-huh.
And we just did a really fun video with them that's coming out next month where we were all sent a mystery sachet of dry yeast and we weren't told what it was. And we were told to just brew a beer, add the yeast in, and then taste the beer and tell me what the yeast strain was. So we had all of the members do that, and then we would reveal on camera what the
Okay.
yeast strain actually was and whether people were right or not. And it was
Okay. Which
really funny.
I'll get you to tell me once we're done recording, just because I would love to see how it goes. Because for I'm thinking because my go-to yeast is USO5, or I go with
Yeah.
Verdant IPA. So it'll be very interesting to find out what it is. But obviously, for the sake of confidentiality and to not spoil anything, I'll ask you off air. So that concludes the interview with a homebrewer with Martin from Brulosophy, formerly the Homebrew Challenge. Thank you so much for your time, Martin, and also have a good holiday period because that's coming up. Have you got a brew ready to drink for Christmas time? Because I've actually just dropped, or holiday time, I should say. I've just dropped a red IPA ready to go, and I'm going to be calling it Merry Pissmas.
Oh, I love it.
Yep. What about yourself? Do you have a brew ready?
Well, I mean, I always have brew readies, but they're mainly experiment beers at this point. So they're either short and shoddy recipes or hop chronicles, which is where we just try a single hop.
Yep.
But fortunately, my wife has just got back from England yesterday, and she filled up her suitcase with English beers for us to work through. She filled it up so much that when she went to check her bag in
Yep.
at the airport, they told us she was overweight. So she actually had to pull 6 of the beer cans out because they wouldn't let her travel with them. And then it's like,
Yep.
what do you do with them? She goes outside of the airport in Heathrow and finds a homeless guy. It's
Oh, I
like,
love that.
"You'd like 6 craft beers." It's like, oh yeah, I'd love
Yeah.
that. So,
Merry Christmas, sir. Happy holidays. That's
Merry
wonderful.
Christmas. Yeah, so,
That's
so that's what
wonderful.
we'll be working for. But yeah, no, look, thanks so much for having me on. And I, I love hearing from people who are somewhat new to the hobby. This is like something you've picked up recently, which is just
Yep.
fantastic. And to keep this thing going, we need more people like you who are really enthused about doing this and wanting to try all of these things and then sharing what they're doing as well. So
Yep.
yeah, a pleasure to be on.